Why do airplanes from all over the world avoid flying directly over Tibet? A straight-line route would clearly save both time and fuel. Yet airlines are willing to spend hundreds of thousands, even millions, of extra dollars every year just to fly around it. The reason is simple. Tibet is one of the most challenging and potentially dangerous regions on Earth for commercial aviation. Because if something goes wrong up there, especially an emergency requiring a rapid descent or diversion, the situation can become far more dangerous than in most other parts of the world. First of all, Tibet isn't just a mountain range. It's a vast plateau. In fact, it's the highest plateau on Earth, with an average elevation of about 14,800 feet, 4,500 meters. And that's only part of the challenge. The Tibetan Plateau is surrounded by some of the highest mountains in the world. Besides Mount Everest, the region contains 13 peaks higher than 26,000 feet, 8,000 meters, and dozens more above 23,000 feet, 7,000 meters. If an aircraft suffers a malfunction or cabin depressurization during flight, pilots must immediately descend to a safe altitude. Typically, that means descending to somewhere between 10,000 and 13,000 feet, 3,000 to 4,000 meters, where passengers can breathe without supplemental oxygen. The problem? Below the aircraft is an entire plateau averaging 14,800 feet above sea level. There may simply be nowhere low enough to descend safely. The emergency oxygen masks that deploy automatically on commercial airliners usually provide oxygen for only 15 to 20 minutes. They're designed to keep passengers alive while the aircraft descends to breathable altitudes. Over Tibet, however, the aircraft may remain trapped in high-altitude airspace long after the oxygen supply runs out. And that's only one part of the problem. Tibet is also one of the least suitable places in the world for an emergency landing. The terrain is extremely rugged, and aviation infrastructure remains relatively limited. Despite being one of the largest and highest plateaus on Earth, Tibet has only a small number of civilian airports. Most of those airports are built between mountains at elevations exceeding 10,000 feet, 3,000 meters, with some approaching 13,000 feet, 4,000 meters. High-altitude airports create a unique set of challenges. The most obvious is landing speed. The higher the airport, the thinner the air. To generate enough lift, aircraft must maintain a higher true airspeed. At a typical sea-level airport, a commercial jet might touch down at around 155 miles per hour, 250 kilometers per hour. At a Tibetan airport above 13,000 feet, the same aircraft may touch down at over 185 miles per hour, 300 kilometers per hour. Combine that with limited runway lengths at some airports, and operational risks increase significantly. The region is also known for runway icing, powerful crosswinds, and rapidly changing weather conditions. During World War II, the Allies established an air route from India to China known as the Hump. The route stretched roughly 500 miles, 800 kilometers, with portions crossing the Tibetan Plateau and Himalayan region. On paper, it wasn't especially long. In reality, it became one of the deadliest air routes in aviation history. Fuel frequently froze. Winds sometimes exceeded 185 miles per hour, 300 kilometers per hour. Severe turbulence was common. There were almost no alternate airfields available. Enemy attacks added even more danger. By the end of the war, more than 500 aircraft and over 1,600 crew members had been lost along the route. The death toll exceeded that of some of the war's most famous air campaigns. The atmosphere over Tibet presents another challenge. The Himalayas act like a giant wall that disrupts air circulation and creates powerful turbulence. The turbulence here isn't just the kind that spills coffee. Strong vertical air currents can toss even large commercial jets around like kites. Pilots call one of the most dangerous forms of this phenomenon wind shear, sudden changes in wind speed and direction that can destabilize an aircraft within seconds. At cruising altitude, temperatures outside the aircraft can fall below -58 degrees Fahrenheit -50 degrees Celsius. Jet fuel typically begins approaching its freezing point at around -53 degrees Fahrenheit -47 degrees Celsius. Modern airliners have fuel heating systems, but prolonged exposure to extreme cold still increases operational risks. It's one of the situations pilots would rather avoid. Aircraft systems can also face additional challenges. Modern airliners rely on GPS, weather radar, sensors, and satellite communications. Over Tibet, the effectiveness of some systems can be reduced by terrain limitations and sparse ground infrastructure. Radar coverage is less extensive than in major aviation corridors. Air traffic control resources are also more limited. In an emergency, even after transmitting an international distress signal, assistance may not arrive as quickly as it would in more densely developed regions. And rescue operations themselves are extremely difficult. Most conventional helicopters struggle to operate effectively above 13,000 to 16,000 feet, 4,000 to 5,000 meters. The thin air makes it difficult for rotor blades to generate enough lift. Although specially modified helicopters have conducted rescues at even higher altitudes in places like Nepal and Switzerland, such missions are rare and extremely risky. A real-world example occurred in 2018. A Sichuan Airlines flight traveling from Chongqing to Lhasa suffered a catastrophic cockpit windshield failure. The cabin rapidly depressurized. The flight crew responded immediately and successfully diverted to Chengdu. One major reason the outcome was successful was that the aircraft had not yet entered the heart of the Tibetan Plateau. Had the incident occurred just 30 minutes later, the consequences could have been far worse. There is another factor as well: airspace management. Tibetan airspace is tightly regulated. Foreign airlines generally must obtain approval before flying through certain portions of the region, and those approvals are not always granted. Sometimes the reasons are technical. Sometimes they involve airspace management requirements or temporary restrictions. Tibet's location along China's border also makes it a strategically sensitive region. As a result, Chinese authorities have long preferred to limit unnecessary foreign overflights in certain areas. Because of all these factors, even when a direct route across Tibet appears possible on a map, most international airlines choose to fly around it. A small number of flights do cross Tibetan airspace. However, these routes are relatively rare and are often operated by Chinese airlines using aircraft and procedures specifically adapted for high-altitude operations. Some people may wonder. The Andes and the Alps are also very high mountains. Why do aircraft routinely fly over them? The answer is that neither region forms a massive, continuous ultra-high plateau comparable to the Tibetan Plateau. In addition, those regions generally have denser airport networks, larger cities, and more developed air traffic systems. If an emergency occurs, pilots usually have multiple diversion options available. The Tibetan Plateau is not only higher, it is also far more remote. The overall operating environment is simply more demanding. Could this change in the future? In theory, yes. More high-altitude airports, stronger air traffic infrastructure, and expanded aviation rescue networks could improve conditions. But doing so would require investments worth tens of billions of dollars. And the payoff would mainly be saving some flights a few dozen minutes of travel time. From an economic standpoint, that is difficult to justify. Which is why, despite the additional time and fuel costs, the overwhelming majority of commercial airliners continue to avoid flying directly over Tibet. Because for airlines, nothing matters more than safety.